Hi guys, here are some highlights from Chapter 7 of the textbook. I'm also going to go back a little bit and discuss some of the finer points from Chapter 6 that you'll need to know for the test. Okay, getting right into it. Just to kind of recap, we talked about the olive branch petition in class. Again, olive branch, the ancient Greek symbol for peace, was exactly that. It was a peace offering to the British. After the Battle of Bunker Hill and Washington's siege of Boston, many Americans still hoped that they could, kind of find a peaceable solution to the whole conflict with the British. So in July 1775, Congress sent the olive branch petition to King George III, asking him to sort of put an end to this conflict before it escalated any further, costing more lives, costing more money, things like that. The problem was, and we talked about this in class, the slow nature of travel back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. By the time that the olive branch petition had even reached the king, he had already declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. So the war had been pretty much irreversibly started at that point. There was nothing that the Americans could do except prepare to fight after that. So to get Americans in the mood to fight, in 1776, a patriot named Thomas Paine writes a pamphlet called Common Sense. And in this pamphlet, he declares that the Americans really don't owe anything to Britain. And that's because America's ties to the British really didn't benefit them in any way. Americans were actually hurt by being dragged into British wars. They were the ones with the taxes forced on them after the British spent a couple hundred years trying to tax them so that they could continue to expand their overseas empire. And the whole list of causes of the Revolutionary War that we talked about, in the past couple weeks. It all factors in to the fact that the Americans were actually hurt by the British instead of benefiting from the relationship with their mother country. So 120,000 copies of this Common Sense pamphlet were printed to persuade Americans that independence was the only way to be truly free. And it worked. Very important picture here. Very famous picture. And it shows the process of creating the Declaration of Independence. When you look at the picture, looking from left to right, you see Benjamin Franklin sitting here reading what appears to be the Declaration itself. You see John Adams, who was the second president of the United States. And you see Thomas Jefferson, who was responsible for writing the Declaration of Independence and who later became our third president. So what this picture is trying to show us, you see all these cluttered papers and books kind of laying kind of messily on the floor there. And the idea behind the picture is that you are meant to see the process. You're supposed to see that the Declaration was not perfect the first time that Thomas Jefferson wrote it. It was a draft, kind of like when you're in English class and you're writing a paper and you go through many drafts and you have people proofread. That's what Thomas Jefferson is doing here. He's having his companions proofread the document before, it's kind of finalized. So Benjamin Franklin and John Adams actually suggested many changes, and they worked together on the final copy of the document. But that's what all these papers kind of strewn about are there to show. They're there to show that the document was a work in progress. It wasn't just something he kind of wrote off the cuff and then distributed. It was worked on by several people, even though Thomas Jefferson is the original one who wrote it. So kind of getting into some details about the war here. A couple of details about the role that African Americans played in the war. General George Washington at first did not allow African Americans to enlist in the Continental Army. He was worried that it would become a haven for escaped slaves, and he didn't want that. He didn't want a bunch of slaves escaping and joining the Continental Army. The British caught on that if the Americans weren't going to let African Americans fight in their army, the British could really benefit from that. So from basically the very beginning of the war, they offered full freedom to any African American slave who fought on their side in the war. By the end of the war, when George Washington had kind of seen the error of his ways, about 15% of the entire Continental Army were African American soldiers. Okay, so we kind of have what has come to be a very important painting in American history, and it's called Washington Crosses the Delaware. And kind of give you a little background on that. For a long time, it seemed like Great Britain was going to win this war, and morale or motivation for the American soldiers got pretty low. So you see General George Washington here leading his soldiers across the very icy Delaware River, and he's doing that to surprise a group of British and Hessian troops in the town of Trenton in New Jersey. So that's kind of what the painting is illustrating. And this painting is depicting one of the big turning points in the war. The Battle of Trenton was one of the first, even though it was a surprise that the Americans pulled it off, it was one of their first major victories. So The Crisis is another pamphlet by Thomas Paine, same guy who wrote Common Sense. And it was really written in a time when the Americans were not expecting that they were going to win the war. As I said, the morale was low. So this is something that George Washington shared with his troops to kind of boost morale, to kind of as a pep talk to them before they embarked on their dangerous journey across the Delaware River to attack the British and the Hessians at Trenton. So the Battle of Trenton was actually on Christmas of 1776. And for the battle, George Washington's Continental Army crossed the icy Delaware River to surprise the Hessians camped at Trenton. The problem for the Hessians and the British was they had just taken kind of the night off, so to speak, and they had had a big feast for Christmas, and they were all basically fast asleep. They weren't really paying much attention. They didn't really expect the Americans to attack. So as a result, the Americans were able to sneak up on them, and they ended up taking over 1,000 Hessian and British prisoner, and it really turned the tide of the war. Another battle that helped to turn the tide of the war was the Battle of Saratoga, on which, again, General Washington's militia was able to surprise British General Burgoyne's troops coming in from Canada. The British had pulled troops south from Canada. And winning this battle is actually what inspired the French to intervene on behalf of the Americans, which, as we know, the Americans needed gunpowder, lead bullets, soldiers, and ships from the French. So that was another turning point in the war. And finally, the Revolutionary War was a long war, 8 years long, and there were many battles, many skirmishes, but it's kind of just on us to get the highlights. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to the Battle of Yorktown. And actually, Yorktown was widely seen as a huge tactical victory for George Washington. He kind of tricked the British into being cornered, and that's how they won the war. So the commander of the British Southern Army was General Cornwallis, and he had taken 8,000 of his troops to the port of Yorktown, South Carolina, and he was stationed there. And what George Washington ended up doing is pinning him up against the ocean with 16,000 troops, kind of on the land side of things, and then the French fleet had finally come in to block the British escape. So because they had kind of boxed the British in there, it forced the British to surrender their entire Southern army of 8,000 troops, and it effectively ended the war. So it was a huge battle and a huge tactical victory for George Washington. But could not have been done without America's French allies. So the Revolutionary War officially ends in 1783. And the treaty that ended the war was called the Treaty of Paris. And it had three important parts. First, Britain had to accept the USA was now an independent, free nation. Britain also had to give up all land between the Mississippi River and the Atlantic Ocean. So all of this in green here was given to the brand new country of the United States of America. One thing the U.S. had to do is return all property taken from loyalists or people who supported the British during the Revolutionary War. Because many loyalists did not trust the new American government to make good on that promise, over 80,000 loyalists ended up leaving the United States to settle in British Canada. So all of this land up here in pink. So that's quite a large number of people that we lost, but we gained a brand new country that was now free and independent. So that really wraps it up. That kind of is like the very, very quick, I know it's a 10-minute video, but a very, very quick overview of Chapter 7, and it really covers a lot of the main points of what you're going to need to know for the test. So hopefully this is something that you're able to watch and look back at to study for the upcoming test over Chapter 6 and 7 from the book. Okay, thank you for listening, guys.